Your grandparents broke the law every single day, not because they were criminals, not because they were reckless, because the government looked at a century of self-sufficient living and decided the problem wasn't poverty or hunger or dependence. The problem was the people who didn't need help. What follows are 15 skills that kept American families alive for generations, skills taught by mothers to daughters and fathers to sons, handed down through wars and droughts and depressions, skills that someone, somewhere decided you were better off not knowing. Here's what they took and how it worked. Rainwater harvesting. A barrel under a downspout. That was the whole system. Your grandmother set it up in an afternoon, and every time it rained, she had water for the garden, for the animals, and for washing, water that fell from the sky and cost her nothing. In some states today, that barrel is a criminal act. Colorado spent decades telling residents that rainwater belonged to the state before the law changed in 2016. Arizona still limits collection based on roof size. Utah restricted it until 2010. The argument was always about water rights, downstream users, senior claims, and prior appropriation doctrines that made rainwater a commodity the moment it hit your roof. Your grandmother didn't know she was stealing. She thought she was catching rain. Gray water recycling. The water that drained out of the sink went into a bucket. The bucket went to the garden. Dishwater, laundry rinse water, bath runoff, none of it got wasted. It went back into the ground where it came from. In most American municipalities today, diverting that water before it reaches the sewer line is a code violation. Some jurisdictions classify it as a health hazard. The reasoning involves treatment standards and contamination risk, which sounds reasonable until you remember that the alternative is sending soapy rinse water through a treatment plant and then charging you for the privilege. The bucket was faster. The bucket was free. The bucket is now illegal in 43 states without a permit.
Seed saving. At the end of every growing season, the best plants were chosen before harvest. Not eaten, dried, stored in paper envelopes with handwritten labels, the date, the variety, the notes from that year's garden. Those seeds went into a tin, and the tin went on a shelf, and next spring the family didn't spend $1 on planting stock. The Monsanto Protection Act of 2013 and a series of plant patent expansions made saving seeds from patented varieties a federal infringement. Farmers who unknowingly grew patented crops from seed that crossed onto their land have been sued. The seeds your great-grandmother kept in a coffee can are now intellectual property. She would not have understood that sentence. Backyard chickens. 3 hens in a small pen behind the house, fresh eggs every morning. For most of American history, this was as ordinary as a vegetable garden. Then zoning codes arrived, and after zoning codes came homeowners associations, and after homeowners associations came municipal ordinances that classified a laying hen as livestock and livestock as incompatible with residential zoning. More than half of American cities with populations over 100,000 have outright bans or severe restrictions on backyard poultry. A boy, a small pen, and a basket collected at dawn before school. That act in his childhood home would now carry a fine. Composting toilet. 1 unit, no pipes, no connection to anything outside the room. A composting toilet converts waste into dry material through the same biological process that happens in a compost pile, controlled, contained, and odorless. Families in rural areas used variations of this system for generations. In most American jurisdictions today, it cannot legally replace a conventional septic system. The code requirement is that you still connect to sewer infrastructure, even if the certified unit produces nothing that needs treating. The composting toilet works. The law requires you to buy the system you don't need anyway.
Raw milk. Every farm family with a dairy animal drank milk drawn straight from the animal into a glass. Pasteurization became federal policy gradually, first recommended, then regulated, then mandated for commercial sale. Today, selling raw milk across state lines is a federal crime. 22 states prohibit retail sale entirely. In some states, you can buy a share of a cow and receive the milk from your own animal, a woman at a farm counter, a jar changing hands, a legal workaround that exists specifically because the direct sale is banned. The milk your great-grandmother gave her children every morning, drawn that same hour, is now contraband in more than half the country. Solar dehydration. Sliced thin, laid on a wooden rack, set in a south-facing window or on a clean sheet outside. Fruit, venison, herbs, fish, wooden rack, open air, sunlight. The dried food went into cloth bags or glass jars and stayed good for months. Modern food preservation regulations in many jurisdictions restrict unlicensed food drying for resale, not for personal use, but the line has become legally dangerous in ways it never was before. The dried apple slices your great-grandmother gave the neighbors in November were a gift, a cloth bag passing from one hand to another. The same exchange today, documented, can trigger cottage food law enforcement. Slow sand water filtration. Gravel at the bottom, sand above it, water poured in at the top, and clean water was drawn from a spigot at the base. Slow sand filtration is one of the oldest water purification methods in documented history. A properly built slow sand filter removes bacteria, parasites, and turbidity through biological action in the top layer of sand. No chemicals, no power, no moving parts. In most American jurisdictions, it cannot legally serve as a primary water source for a dwelling. You're required to connect to municipal water or install an approved well system. An inspector with a clipboard would condemn the filter your great-grandfather built in a wooden barrel, the one that gave clean water to his family through 2 droughts, on the first visit. Backyard beekeeping. A single hive in the corner of the yard produced honey, wax, and pollination for the garden. Urban beekeeping bans became widespread through the mid-20th century, the same era that saw colony collapse disorder begin. New York City banned beekeeping entirely until 2010. Many municipalities still require permits, minimum lot sizes, neighbor notification, and setback distances that make a single backyard hive effectively illegal on any suburban property. The hive your grandfather kept between the garden and the fence now requires a man with a clipboard walking the yard before a single beehive can be placed. Open fire smoking. Meat hung in a purpose-built smokehouse, hardwood smoldering for 12 to 48 hours. The smoke preserved the meat and built flavor that no refrigeration has replicated. Open fire smoking for personal use is still legal in most rural areas, but open burning ordinances, air quality regulations, and neighborhood codes have made backyard smokehouses effectively impossible in suburban and urban zones. In air quality management districts, California's South Coast District being the most aggressive, even recreational wood burning faces restrictions, bans, and fines on designated no-burn days. The smokehouse your great-grandfather built from rough lumber in 1921 would require a burn permit today. Foraging on public land. The family went to the woods and came back with food. Hickory nuts, blackberries, wild onions, watercress, chanterelles, whatever was in season, whatever grew. National parks prohibit the removal of any natural material. National forests technically allow limited personal use foraging in some areas, but the enforcement varies and the regulations are rarely posted. State parks have their own rules, most of them restrictive. The legal principle underlying most of these restrictions is preservation, which is reasonable at scale. But your great-grandmother wasn't managing a national ecosystem. She was filling a basket. The woods were there, the food was there, she took it home. Hand-dug wells. A man with a shovel and a sense of where the water table sat could put a well in a weekend. Stone-lined, timber-cribbed, or bare earth, the hand-dug well served American farmsteads for 3 centuries. Today, in most jurisdictions, a well requires a licensed driller, a permitted location, a casing specification, a pump installation standard, and a water test before it can serve as a legal water source. The permit alone can cost hundreds of dollars. The drilling can cost several thousand. The hand-dug well your great-grandfather put in behind the barn, the one that served the family for 40 years, would be condemned on inspection and require replacement with a system costing more than the property was worth. Adobe and cob construction. Earth, straw, and water, sometimes lime, built by hand, on site, from materials pulled from the ground nearby.
Adobe and cob construction sustained settlements across the American Southwest and plains for centuries before European contact and centuries after. Modern building codes require engineered foundations, load calculations, and materials that meet standardized compression and insulation ratings. In most U.S. jurisdictions, an earthen structure cannot receive a certificate of occupancy regardless of how it was built. The walls your great-grandmother's people raised by hand in New Mexico in 1890, walls still standing today, could not be legally built on the same lot under the current county code. Home fermentation. A crock on the kitchen counter, cabbage, salt, thyme. Sauerkraut, fermented pickles, cider vinegar, and preserved cabbage. Lacto-fermentation kept vegetables edible through winter without refrigeration and delivered the same cultures that modern medicine now sells back in capsule form. Home fermentation for personal use remains legal, but prohibition's ghost lives in the laws around fermented beverages. Home brewing is federally legal up to 100 gallons per adult per year, but home distillation remains a federal crime, regardless of proof or purpose. Fermented cider is legal. The next step, run through a copper coil, is not. Your great-grandfather didn't see a difference. The law draws a hard line at the still. Copper still for water distillation. Of every item on this list, the copper still carries the most enforcement history. A copper still is a simple device, a vessel to heat liquid, a coiled tube to condense vapor, and a collection container at the end. Your great-grandfather used one to purify water when the well ran dry. He used one to process cider. He used one because it was a tool, the same as a saw or a press. Federal law has prohibited unlicensed distillation since 1862, a Civil War revenue measure that was never repealed. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau classifies an unregistered still as contraband. Possession alone in many states carries a criminal penalty. The copper coil your great-grandmother's father bent by hand and hung in the barn outlasted 3 generations of the family. It would be evidence in a court trial today. Your grandparents didn't think of themselves as outlaws. They thought of themselves as people who knew how to live. The water they caught, the food they grew, the animals they kept, the structures they built, none of it required permission because permission hadn't been invented yet for those things. The regulations came later, and the regulations had reasons, and some of those reasons were legitimate, but the result was the same. A generation of practical knowledge that had sustained American families for centuries was reclassified as dangerous, unlicensed, or illegal. They didn't lose the skills were taken. Drop a comment. Which one did you never know was illegal?